Good afternoon, everybody. Hi, my name's Paul Edgar. I work with the Clements Center for National Security. Take a seat. No worries. We're not in a rush. Maybe our authors are in a rush. My name's Paul Edgar. I work with the Clements Center for National Security. Welcome to a conversation with the authors of McNamara at War: A New History. Get your copy here in the back. If you miss out on the copies in the back, you can find it on Amazon or your preferred book dealer. I want to thank our partners, the LBJ Library and the LBJ Foundation, Mark Updegrove and team. The University of Texas Department of History are our partners in this event. And sometimes our students have, I'd like to highlight this, that sometimes our students have performed duties as research assistants for the Taubmans. I don't know whether or not that's true of this book, but it has occurred in the past, and so we're very happy to host them for many reasons. My introduction of the Taubmans will be brief. I'll highlight just a couple of things. First, Philip Taubman is an affiliate with the Center for International Security and Cooperation at Stanford University. And we had him here just a couple of years ago for his last book, George Shultz, In the Nation's Service, The Life and Times of George P. Shultz, which was published in 2023 by Stanford University Press. And his brother, William Taubman, the Bertrand Snell Professor of Political Science, Emeritus at Amherst College, Pulitzer Prize winner for his book, Khrushchev, The Man and His Era. And this talk will be moderated by our own Professor Mark Atwood Lawrence, Chair of the History Department here at the University of Texas and the Walter Prescott Webb Chair in History and Ideas, former Director of the LBJ Library and current Director of Graduate Programs at the Clements Center. And we couldn't think of anybody better to moderate this. The LBJ era and Vietnam are Mark's intellectual wheelhouse. One quick introductory comment before we get to the more interesting and more important people that you came to see. Robert McNamara is a controversial, of course, and fascinating figure for so many reasons. And I think he's a very important person to study, a very important person for our students to study, because he was a brilliant and accomplished American who yet struggled with war, of course, the Vietnam War. And it's not because he was a fool, it's because war is very hard. And that's what we like to teach our students. War is hard. Approach it with authentic humility, authentic moral compass, and with as much intellectual preparation as possible. So we really could not be happier with our guests, with the material that they will be talking about, and with this recently published book, McNamara at War. So please give a hand to our guests, the Taubmans and Mark Lawrence.
Oh, thank you so much, Paul. Thank you to the Clements Center, Admiral McGuire. Thank you to the LBJ Foundation, LBJ Library. It is really fantastic to be back here. Thanks to all of you for coming along to what promises to be a really interesting event about a really interesting book. And it's an honor to be up here, sort of up here, with these two very distinguished authors and historians, gentlemen from whom I've learned a ton over the years about so many aspects of the history of the Cold War. And if I could spend 10 seconds on a personal note, it's really nice to be sitting here with the person who gave me my first job out of college. Who knew 30 plus years later we would be brought together by Robert McNamara. So, Robert McNamara, a lot has been said, a lot has been published. How did you come to him as a topic for a new biography?
Well, first of all, thank you all for coming. My thanks to the LBJ Library, the LBJ Foundation, and the University of Texas at Austin. I have felt welcomed here now several times. I've sat in on classes here, talked to graduate students a number of times. And one can't help but spend time here and not be impressed with the academic quality of this institution. And let me say, there was a UT Austin research assistant whom you should all be very proud of. His name is Cameron Waltz. He was an undergraduate here. My brother and I knew we needed a lot of research at the LBJ Library. And we got in touch, we put out a job posting, and Mark got in touch with one of my colleagues at Stanford and said, you should hire Cameron. And we did. And Cameron did a fabulous job. He spent weeks and weeks and weeks digging into the Johnson papers, the McNamara papers at the LBJ Library. And I'm happy to report, some of you may already know this, that Cameron is now at Stanford getting his master's in East Asian Studies, and he is also a Knight Hennessy scholar at Stanford. So my thanks to UT for Cameron. So why did we end up doing this book at this moment? So the backstory actually has a Stanford link to it. When McNamara died in 2009, he had remarried. He'd been married for many decades, and his first wife had died, and he had subsequently remarried. And when he died, he left papers with his widow, Diana, who still lives in Northern Virginia. And she looked through the papers and thought there might be interesting material here that could form the basis for a new book about Robert McNamara. And among those materials were some really fascinating letters that McNamara's mother had written to McNamara when he was a young man, including at the time he was a student at Harvard Business School. They shed light on the nature of McNamara's home life, his relationship with his mother and father, that I think gave some insights into his childhood and early years. There were letters that McNamara had exchanged with his new bride, Margie, after they got married, when he was working in the Army Air Corps. And those shed light on Robert McNamara as a husband, and then as time passed, as the father of a young child. And there were also a set of extraordinary letters from Jacqueline Kennedy to Robert McNamara, letters that bespoke a very close relationship that had developed between the two of them during the Kennedy presidency, and even more so in the Johnson presidency and beyond after the Johnson presidency. So Diana got in touch with a friend of hers at Stanford who got in touch with another Stanford person. My phone rings and someone's on that line I know and says, would you be interested in doing a new book about Robert McNamara? And I said, you know, I don't know. He said, you better go back to Washington and look at this material that Diana has. So I did. I looked at it, and the moment I saw it, I said, there's another book to be done about McNamara. So the project began when I went back to Washington in 2010.
Bill, please jump in if there's anything you'd care to add.
Well, I would, first of all, I'm glad to be part of this, although thousands of miles away. But when Phil asked me to work with him on this book, I agreed immediately, because although my previous books had all been on Russia, a biography of Khrushchev, a biography of Gorbachev, but I felt I had no more Russian leader that I wanted to write about. Perhaps Putin, but if I were to write about Putin, I might have ended up in a ditch. So when I had a chance to write about an American, I leaped at the opportunity, and that's how I got on board.
And leaped at the chance to write a book with your brother, so that says something about your relationship.
Yes, yes. In that connection, I might say that my wife and I had a dear Russian friend, a woman we'd known for decades, who said immediately, Bill and Phil will quarrel. She expected us to have a big fight, but we didn't. And one reason we didn't was that our approaches coincided, complemented each other. But another was, if we were to have quarreled, I would have had seniority.
Well, I think some of the students in the audience would love to hear more about your methods for team writing this book and about your relationship. But let's get back to McNamara. Obviously, an extraordinarily complicated and controversial figure. You say at the end of your introduction to the book, quoting Shakespeare, you know, your mission in the book is not to bury or to praise him. It's just to basically tell his story. And yet, one still has to wonder how the two of you as authors approach this controversial subject, what some of your attitudes were going in, and perhaps how your thinking about this man changed over the course of your work on the book.
So I'll go first here, even though I lack seniority. My attitude about McNamara, my underlying view of him, I would say, deepened greatly by the process of doing this book. I learned a lot about him I didn't know. I came to understand facets of his character that I had no idea existed. But at the end of the project, I think I felt much the way I did at the beginning. I was not a fan of the Vietnam War. I didn't get drafted. I didn't fight in Vietnam. But I doubted the wisdom of the war at the time. This project certainly didn't change my view of that. And in the end, I don't really respect McNamara for his conduct because, as Bill and I say in the book, he lived a kind of double life during the Johnson administration. He was a proponent of the war in the councils of the Johnson administration, while he was an opponent of the war in private discussions with the Kennedys and others. I think he missed the opportunity. He himself acknowledged this late in life. He missed the opportunity to figure out what the right thing to do at that point was. And he then spent the rest of his life sort of psychologically tormented over the role that he had played in Vietnam and his failure to quit the administration and protest the war he didn't believe in. Bill?
Well, I think I had a pretty superficial view of McNamara before starting on this. I knew what most people knew, that he'd been a brilliant Secretary of Defense. I knew that he had been the chief spokesman for the war. I had no idea what we discovered, which is that he had decided as early as the end of 1965 that the war was unwinnable. Yet he stayed on for 2 or 3 years, presiding over it. I'd say one more thing that's more general than about McNamara. We all read about politicians and big shots in government and elsewhere, and we get a superficial sense of them from what we learn. But to write a book about a person, to do all the research that we did, is to see a person in depth, to discover layers of all sorts, and to come away knowing so much that it's exciting, and in this case, it's sad, because we learned it. He was tormented. And I think, as I look at today's leaders and know so little about them, I'm just struck by the fact that it presents McNamara in the kind of detail that I think very few people have. It's just very, very exciting to see a person so complex in all of his complexity.
I think one of the real accomplishments of the book is to show the depth and complexity of McNamara's character, but above all, his capacity for emotion, right? There's this cliche, I think, that a lot of us probably hold of this as who was it who put it? The computer with legs,
Barry
Barry Goldwater. A lot of us, I think, hold that idea that this was a cold, detached man who was more at home with statistics than with human questions. But it turns out in your book that there's a whole lot more to it than that. Talk about the process of discovering this richer person, and ultimately what that discovery of the emotional qualities of this man means for how we should understand McNamara's life story.
Bill, do you want to jump in?
Okay, well, it's partly reading about moments in his life during his period at the Pentagon, when at a party or even a public event, he would suddenly break down and weep. We write about, several of these events, which were stunning, unbelievable. We also talked to people who knew him and felt he was much more warm and friendly than the world realized. And it was also discovering in the evolution of his life, that even as he climbed to the top and his brilliance took him there, at least early on in college and in graduate school, he would try to help people whom he regarded as not as smart as he was. He would reach out to people struggling with the curriculum of Harvard Business School. I think as time went by, that kind of openness and warmth faded, and he seemed more and more imperious. But it was there, that tendency to be helpful to people, not just to grab the brass ring and shine in the spotlights.
Yeah, so I think, I'll answer the question slightly differently about how we learn these things. As a piece of research or historiography, when you do these projects, I've done a number now, you're always surprised at the depth of understanding you can derive from burrowing into archival material, much of which in this case was right here at the LBJ Library. But at other libraries, we found invaluable materials at the Kennedy Library, I suppose not surprisingly. There are oral histories that almost all senior government officials do at some point after they've left their jobs. And these are held in repositories all around the country. There's some here. There are a lot at the Miller Center at the University of Virginia. They're at Columbia University, Princeton, University of Michigan. You look around the country and you're going to find really revealing oral histories by the protagonists of various presidencies. And if you go through those with an eye to trying to understand the character, not just what the individual you're writing about did, but the character of that individual, there are real insights that you can find in the archives. And then we had the benefit, I call it the Fellowship of Authors, which is a lot of books have been written about Robert McNamara. And the authors of those books very generously gave us all of their, so we would refer to them in the movie industry as outtakes, all of the notes that they had taken, all the transcripts of all the interviews they had done for their books. And in the case of McNamara's own book, which came out in 1995 called In Retrospect, Peter Osnos and Brian Vandemark, Peter is a journalist and publisher, and Brian is a professor at the Naval Academy. They worked very closely with McNamara on his book. They had printed transcripts of dozens of interviews with Robert McNamara. The number of pages of those transcripts, literally, it was a stack of papers this high. They gave us copies of those. And so when you read through these closely, and you read through the transcripts of the LBJ McNamara conversations that were recorded, and you look at listen to those recordings, out of that you gain an understanding of the kind that Bill is talking about.
Now, of course, I want to get before long to the meat of the book, which is really Vietnam. But you have several chapters at the beginning, as any biography probably should, that chronicle the earlier parts of his life. And the portrait that, at least to my reading, emerges is of a highly successful, even likable guy who was an academic superstar, no question, but knew how to have fun, was a fun person to be around, at least in the recollection of some of the people who interacted with him. I come away from the book thinking if you could somehow pluck Vietnam out of that story, we would be talking about someone who is a genuinely admirable person who held remarkably important positions at the Harvard Business School in the Second World War, and then most strikingly at Ford Motors. How should we think about those early phases? Am I onto something? And thinking about that, if we could somehow remove Vietnam, we would have a very different persona.
I think so. And Bill took the lead on those early chapters. So, Bill?
Yes. Yes, I'd like to say, first of all, that Brian Vandermark, whom Phil just mentioned, it turned out he had more than 2,000 pages of interviews because he had set out to write a biography of McNamara. And then in the course of his talking to McNamara persuaded him to help him write McNamara's own book. But when I visited Brian Vandermark at Annapolis, I hoped that he would be willing to show us his interviews. And by goodness, he did. 2,000 pages. And suddenly in these interviews, we are encountering high school classmates at Berkeley, business school classmates at Harvard, fellow officers, top generals in the military during World War II, and then people at the Ford Motor Company. And what came through, you're quite right, was, sorry about that. I'm going to give the phone, oh no. I guess it's just ringing in my, can you turn it off, Jane? Sorry. Okay. Sorry, folks. This is you're seeing the inside story of my life, not just McNamara's. But you're quite right, Mark, that you could depict all his years leading up to 1961, when he took office in the Pentagon, as surmounting one challenge after another. He just met and won every fight that he encountered. He was just brilliant. And then the challenge he couldn't meet was Vietnam. So this is a guy who, I want to say one more thing about Harvard. After the war, he fully expected to go back to Harvard Business School until it turned out he went to the Ford Motor Company. But he said, and we quoted in the book, that the years at Harvard Business School were the happiest years of his life. And I think he would have been wonderfully happy and successful had he stayed at Harvard. What I imagine is he would have become dean of the business school and then probably or possibly president of Harvard. And he could have spoken for the world of the academy in the wider world, and he would have lived on happily ever after. In a sense, his very rise to the top was the cause of his fall. If he hadn't risen to the Pentagon, he would have been happy, and we would have looked back on him in just that way.
So let's talk about that rise. The big moment comes, as you say, Bill, in 1961, when the Kennedy administration takes office. What was it about Robert McNamara that made him a natural choice for Kennedy's cabinet, no less an important position than the Secretary of Defense, but also, as it turned out, someone who had a real rapport with the Kennedy family and certainly with JFK himself. Talk a bit about, if you would, the attraction and what it was that pulled Robert McNamara into that world.
So, if you looked around the United States in 1960 during the presidential campaign, McNamara, and looking at CEOs of major corporations, McNamara would have jumped out at you as a very energetic, very successful, very dynamic, effective CEO. Henry Ford was running the company ostensibly, but McNamara had risen up through the ranks after the war and become president of Ford Motor Company. They also, in the Kennedy crowd, thought he was a Republican, and they were looking to have a bipartisan cabinet. So the initial outreach was also abetted by some of the people we historically refer to as wise men who came out of World War II, who helped shape post-war America and the post-war world. Some of them admired McNamara and recommended him to Kennedy, but Kennedy had never met McNamara. And in fact, when Sergeant Shriver first called the executive suite at Ford after Kennedy's election, and the message came to McNamara to return this call. He didn't recognize the name, and he didn't return the call. And then the second call came through. He returns the call, and Shriver gets on the phone and says, "Mr. McNamara, my brother-in-law would like to consider you for some cabinet posts. Would you be interested in being Treasury Secretary?" Which makes sense, the guy's a business executive. And McNamara says, "I have no qualification whatsoever to be Treasury Secretary." And then Shriver says, "Well, how about Defense Secretary?" And McNamara says the same thing, to which Shriver says, "Well, will you give the president-elect the courtesy of coming to Washington and speaking to him before you turn down a job?" So I won't go through the whole history, but Kennedy selected McNamara barely knowing him, having met him twice, once when McNamara went to do this courtesy interview, and the second time when he came back with a list of conditions to be defense secretary that Kennedy and his brother Bobby instantly accepted, and they stepped out front of the house in Georgetown and named him defense secretary. Kennedy really didn't know McNamara. And that's true in a lot of cabinets. I've written a lot of Cold War history, studied a lot of presidencies. A lot of presidents select people that they don't really know. Oftentimes, their closest acquaintances end up as White House Chief of Staff rather than in a top cabinet position because they're closer in some ways to the president as Chief of Staff than in a cabinet agency. And the truth is that Kennedy made a brilliant choice. Had there been no Vietnam War, had Robert McNamara retired as defense secretary at the end of Kennedy's service after the assassination, or had he served through the first months of the Johnson presidency and left after the election of Johnson in his own right, he would be remembered as the most effective defense secretary in American history because he radically reformed the Pentagon. He brought cost-effective budgeting into play. He consolidated budgeting. He really was the first defense secretary to assert civilian control at the Pentagon. And those reforms that he instituted exist today. They have remained, the budgeting process remains the process essentially, it's obviously evolved, that McNamara imposed in the first years as defense secretary. So the irony for McNamara is his management of defense. It was brutal, it was cold, it alienated a lot of people, but it was extremely effective until Vietnam.
So McNamara, in the Kennedy administration, confronts Vietnam for the first time. There's a really fascinating passage in your book that really jumped out at me, and I'd love to hear your comments on this section of your book by way of teasing out the larger pattern of McNamara's behavior in those early years at the Pentagon. Maxwell Taylor and Walt Rostow go off to Vietnam in the middle of 1961. Really, the Kennedy administration is trying to get its head around this problem, and they come back and they recommend the introduction of combat forces. And McNamara's first reaction, if I understood your book correctly, is to say, yeah, exactly. And then he realizes that Kennedy is not a fan of that line of policymaking at all, and McNamara changes his mind and tries to cover his tracks a bit. What's going on there? And maybe you could use that as a jumping off point for talking about the relationship between McNamara and JFK more generally.
Yeah, Bill, please.
What I'd like to say is that one of McNamara's friends from Harvard Business School, whom he later appointed Secretary of the Air Force, Eugene Zuckert, once said, and we quote this in the book, McNamara was never more comfortable in defending a position than when he was defending the position the boss wanted him to, even when he, McNamara, did not really share that position, which is a way of saying he listened to his bosses and for the most part tried to do what they said. And that seems strange too, because one thinks of him as so brilliant and self-confident that he would have had the strength, the gumption, not to agree from time to time with his boss, the president. But I think that what you pointed to, Mark, is an early example of that. Kennedy's view was now McNamara's view. And at the end, just before Kennedy was assassinated, the two of them shared the view that probably the United States should back out of Vietnam and start reducing the number of advisors, that military advisors we had there. And the question then arises, which has been much debated among scholars, as to whether Kennedy would have done that had he not been assassinated and had he been reelected. But the problem was that although it sounded as if that's what he would do, Kennedy himself was deeply divided in his mind. And he worried in particular, not about the left-wing anti-war critics, because they were not really present at that point in '63. He worried about right-wing politicians who would accuse him of having lost Vietnam, just the way Truman had allegedly lost China. So McNamara adjusted to what the president wanted, and when the president was not sure, McNamara was not sure either.
And of course, in November of 1963, a new president is suddenly catapulted into the Oval Office. And McNamara's relationship with Lyndon Johnson becomes really the center of Vietnam policymaking, and certainly the center of your book in many ways. I'd be interested to hear both of you, if you care to, talk about the nature of that relationship. I mean, it had to be complicated, right? McNamara had shown some doubts about Vietnam. He was also very personally close to both Bobby Kennedy and Jacqueline Kennedy, something that you have wonderful detail concerning in your book. How did that relationship function between Lyndon Johnson and Robert McNamara?
So, I think, like everybody, McNamara was stunned and traumatized by the assassination. He admired JFK so greatly, I think for a variety of reasons, the sort of elegance of the Kennedy presidency, those parts that were elegant, there were parts that were not so elegant. He admired Kennedy because Kennedy had forgiven him for some early mistakes. The biggest one was just days after becoming defense secretary. He has a group of reporters. The defense reporters come into his office at the Defense Department. And you got to remember, McNamara had dealt maybe with the press covering the car industry. Now he's dealing with this Pentagon Press Corps, which is a tough group. And they come into his office, and the ground rules for the discussion are not established so clearly in a way that he understands. He thinks he's talking to them off the record. Anything I say or nothing's going to be printed. It turned out he was talking to them on what in Washington we call on background, meaning we'll talk, you can quote me but not by name, and you can use the information I'm giving you. So in this discussion, and they're all having a drink, by the way, in the Defense Secretary's office, it's late afternoon, McNamara tells them that, you know, the missile gap that Kennedy campaigned on very effectively, namely that the Kremlin had far more intercontinental ballistic missiles than we did, and it was part of the campaign that helped him defeat Nixon in 1960. McNamara says to reporters, that's bunk. We have intelligence that shows that they have very few missiles. We have far more missiles than them. And McNamara later recalls, he's sitting there talking to the reporters, and they rush out the door, you know, to go report this. This is a huge blunder by the new defense secretary, right? And he calls up Kennedy, and he basically says, oh my God, what have I done? Should I resign? And Kennedy says, Bob, don't worry about it. We all make mistakes. So he truly admired Kennedy and had a bond with him and the Kennedys. Okay, LBJ comes into office. You know, LBJ, you here at the library know better than anybody. LBJ had been sidelined by the Kennedys in the Kennedy administration. Yes, he was vice president, but they sent him off to foreign funerals. They didn't involve him in the deliberations of the key questions. He's a very different figure. I don't need to go into the details. You all know. You couldn't find a greater contrast in some ways to JFK than LBJ was. And so now suddenly McNamara is dealing with this very shrewd, tough politician from Texas who has been a master of the Senate, a Senate majority leader, a deal maker, a guy who knows how to manipulate people to a fairly well with flattery on one hand and anger on the other hand. And so McNamara's trying to figure out, how am I dealing with this new guy? And the answer is, he is being effectively manipulated by Johnson, as many of the people who worked for Johnson were. He's also subject to the classic, inevitable deference that senior administration officials give the president, who has appointed them, to whom they owe their jobs. So he feels obliged in some ways to do what the president's telling him. He actually believes at the beginning that we need to engage more heavily in Vietnam. And so they develop this very complicated relationship in which each man is using the other. McNamara is using Johnson to stay in power. He's flattering Johnson. Johnson is flattering him about, Bob, I couldn't do this job without you. He repeatedly, LBJ tells Lady Bird over and over again, this is the most important man in my government. He is the key guy. I couldn't do the job if Bob left the Defense Department. When Bob goes to Vietnam, I worry, I can't sleep at night because I'm afraid he'll get killed, all of this stuff. Very LBJ, right? And so, you know, they develop this kind of rapport. They need each other, basically, to do their jobs. And out of that, I think, and I think the book makes the case, out of that grows this misshapen relationship in which LBJ has the upper hand, of course. And it's a misshapen relationship in which the two men reinforce the idea of escalating in Vietnam.
I'd add something, if I may.
Please, Bill.
At Amherst College, I taught for 10 years a course with a professor of psychology called Personality and Political Leadership. And I learned to look for psychological troubles in people that I studied. And what I came away from reading the 5 volumes of, or 4 volumes so far, of Robert Caro, and reading Lady Bird's memoirs, and reading the recollections of other people like Richard Goodwin and Bill Moyers, I came away with the view that Johnson was practically bipolar. I would love, if I were there with you, to hear from people who know more than I do and how they react to that. But what I read about was that Johnson periodically would take to his bed and cover his head with his pillows and not emerge until Lady Bird begged him to get out and resume his activities. That was the depressive side. The manic side was his feverish activity, which Phil has been describing. But the reason I mention all this is it seems to me that a person like Johnson, who is prone to depression and who himself, and this is related, has mixed views about Vietnam. Half the time he's not sure we should be there at all. There's a famous colloquy with Senator Richard Russell in which Johnson admits that Vietnam is a mess and he doesn't really know what to do about it. Anyway, a person like this, it seems to me, gloms onto McNamara, who is ultra efficient and super self-confident. And so in other words, Johnson desperately needs McNamara, and therefore he flatters him. One incident I remember is that McNamara on a Sunday is grilling hamburgers for lunch with his family, and suddenly there's a phone call from Johnson telling him to drop everything and come on over to the White House and have lunch there. And of course, that's exactly what McNamara does. So anyway, McNamara needs Johnson, Johnson needs McNamara, and out of that comes a pattern of decision-making which is not necessarily in the interests of either one.
Thank you. I want to just pause for a moment to say that in a few minutes, we will have a microphone, and anyone who would care to pose a question will have that opportunity. But two more from me, if I may. So July 1965, the big decisions are made to dramatically increase the American combat commitment in Vietnam. And Phil, I think you said it earlier today, no one in the room spoke more boldly about the necessity for this step than Robert McNamara. Fast forward 6 months, maybe not even that, and you see a Secretary of Defense with very serious misgivings. Though he's not saying so publicly, you can certainly see that behind the scenes. What changed?
You know, the answer to that remains a bit of a mystery. He relied heavily on data coming in from the field, from Saigon, from the American military leaders in Vietnam, and they had metrics, about the number of North Vietnamese troops killed, the number of Viet Cong, the South Vietnamese civilians who fought on behalf of North Vietnam part of the day. Part of the day they were living as civilians in South Vietnam. All these metrics that the military had come up with, and McNamara initially bought into all of that. A lot of it proved to be misleading. The reporters in Vietnam had great leeway. It was the most easily covered war in American history by the press. The restrictions began to increase after that war because of the coverage of the war, which was contrary to the public depictions of the war by McNamara and Johnson and others. And so I think over time, McNamara began to realize that what people like David Halberstam were seeing when they went out in the field was very different from the data coming in from the commanders in Saigon. And he went to Vietnam repeatedly, more and more, of course, as time went on. And, anytime a Secretary of Defense goes anywhere, he's surrounded by security, he's surrounded by military commanders, he's getting a very blinkered view of the battles in some ways, for understandable reasons, his security, and also because the commanders want to make the best case they can. So by the fall of '65, he's clearly beginning to question what's going on. And we know for sure in April of '66, we're now just 9 months after these pivotal decisions that were taken in July at the White House in Camp David, to turn it into an American war, to send tens of thousands of combat troops. McNamara turns to John McNaughton, who records this in his secret diary, and he says to John, "I want to bring the boys home from Vietnam so bad I can barely stand it." So we know by that point he's clearly come to doubt what's going on. And then he goes up to Harvard in the fall He's greeted by a mob of anti-war protesters. It's a crazy scene. They have to escort him in the sewer tunnels under the university to get him to a meeting with Harvard faculty. It's a crazy event. Believe it or not, he's traveling to Harvard with no security detail in the middle of the anti-war protests that are erupting. He sits down with a bunch of Harvard faculty, including a young professor named Henry Kissinger, and he talks to them about the war in a way. He sounds the way George McGovern sounded a few years later about the war. The notes were taken of this discussion by Graham Allison. It's a name many of you know. Graham became dean of the Kennedy School at Harvard and was Assistant Secretary of Defense under, I think it was Bill Clinton. Graham is a young graduate student. I met this morning with a bunch of graduate students here. So Graham Allison is just like you at this point. He's a PhD candidate at Harvard. He's taking the notes. And when you read the notes, they're like 13 pages of typed notes. They're at the Kennedy Library. He's talking about this double guy he's seen. He says, we all thought this was the warrior, the guy who was cold-bloodedly prosecuting the Vietnam War and couldn't care less about what was happening to the troops there. And the guy who we met with turns out to be a saintly figure. Allison didn't use that word, but that's the gist of what he's saying. And he describes McNamara as an opponent of the war. And then, to me, this goes directly to your question about what happened. Why did he change his mind? McNamara tells the Harvard faculty, we've got this policy of village pacification in Vietnam. This was a key element of our strategy. Pacify the villages where the citizens live and the Viet Cong hide out, and it will be a step toward prevailing in South Vietnam. It was a major pillar of American strategy, village pacification. Robert McNamara sits in that room at Harvard and says to the faculty, and I'm quoting him here, I think, we haven't pacified a single village. We haven't pacified a single village. And when McNamara says, tell the commanders in Saigon, I want to go out to the villages and see what's going on, they won't take me. And they won't take me because they're afraid to travel in those areas, and they're afraid to send me into those areas. So clearly, by early 1966, he understands, not just as a theory, but in reality, we are losing the war.
Bill, did you want to add something on this?
Yes, I might add,
Please.
there was an event, a key event, I think in the fall of '65. Norman Morrison, who was a Quaker, took part in a demonstration outside the Pentagon, and then suddenly poured kerosene or gasoline all over himself, and he was holding his toddler child, and he set himself on fire. Fortunately, the people who were watching begged him to give up the child, which he did, but he burned himself to death. This deeply impacted McNamara, and yet when he went home that day, he didn't talk about it with his wife or his children. He compartmentalized his life to that extent, and that made him even worse, sadder. The picture on the cover of our book shows McNamara looking out of the window of the Pentagon, not on that occasion, but on another one, which I might just very briefly describe. On the second occasion, there was a massive demonstration outside the Pentagon, mostly young people. McNamara protected the Pentagon by ordering in troops, but telling them not to fire. And eventually the demonstrators dispersed and left. But in this picture, you can see him looking out the window at that demonstration. But what is ironic and revealing is that we came upon a quote from him somewhere, probably in his memoirs or maybe in an interview later in the 1990s. And McNamara says, if I had been in charge of that demonstration, we would have shut down the Pentagon. And I think that combination of the demonstration of his stopping it with troops and then saying, man, if I had been in charge of that, we would have shut down the Pentagon. That reveals a hell of a lot about him. Both his toughness and his apology for his toughness, and yet his pride at his toughness, all mixed together in a way that he admits he doesn't fully understand.
So please, if you'd like to pose a question, I'd say now might be the moment to line up here, and I will bring my questions to an end simply, well, maybe by posing the biggest one of all, or the one that's generated so much intense interest, and I suspect your book will rekindle this, is already rekindling this. If McNamara had all these doubts, why did he continue to defend the war publicly and not resign from the administration?
So I think the main reason was a sense of loyalty to Johnson and the office of the presidency. There are a host, and I'll come back to that in a second, but there are a host of other factors that led him to stay. One, he believed that if he did resign, especially if he resigned in protest, it would give aid and comfort to the North Vietnamese. And I'm sure that was a legitimate consideration. Secondly, he believed in the domino theory at the time, as did everybody else in the White House in both the Kennedy and Johnson administrations, with very few exceptions. You know, the idea, if we lose Vietnam, all of Southeast Asia will go. If Southeast Asia goes, who knows what's going to happen? Japan may go. You know, he genuinely subscribed to that view, so that was a policy consideration to him. Another factor is if I'm defense secretary, I can try to restrain Johnson from even more extreme measures in Vietnam, like invading North Vietnam with ground troops, which might lead to a confrontation with the Chinese or the Soviet Union, which could escalate into a nuclear war. So better that I should stay rather than have a successor come in who will not moderate those kinds of recommendations. But the primary reason he stayed was this sense of loyalty. And he got questioned about it just a few months after he left the job. He's now president of the World Bank. And Life magazine sends an experienced journalist to interview him. And the Life runs this very long piece about Robert McNamara. And the reporter says to him, "Why did you stay?" And he said, "Well, I stayed because I felt my primary obligation was to serve the President of the United States. I was loyal to the President." And the reporter said, "But Mr. McNamara, the oath of office," he didn't specifically refer to the oath, but that's what he was alluding to. "There is a higher calling, is there not, in Washington if you're a cabinet member? The oath of office that cabinet members take is to the Constitution, to support the Constitution. There's not a word in the oath about the presidency or the office of the presidency." And McNamara brushed that aside. He basically, I don't have his exact words, but his answer was, "That's bunk." Basically, that's bunk. And if we start to behave that way, he said, it will endanger American democracy. That was his answer. You can look it up in Life magazine. And so he had this distorted view of what was required of him in office. When you look back on it, it's just seems amazing that he had this distorted view of loyalty.
Bill, would you want to add anything on that?
Well, I think underlying all of the factors that Phil listed is ambition. His ambition. He is there at the top, and he doesn't want to leave. This reminds me of a story that's told in Richard Goodwin's memoirs. Richard Goodwin was a chief speechwriter for Johnson, had been for Kennedy, and Goodwin is beginning to worry about Johnson's health. in particular about the possibility that I mentioned before that he is, in effect, manic depressive. And so Goodwin decides to talk to Bill Moyers about it. And in their conversation, which Goodwin recounts, Goodwin says, maybe we should talk to McNamara. I mean, he's somebody who would understand, and he's very important, and he could help us figure out what to do. And Moyers says in response, well, I'm not so sure. Maybe McNamara is too ambitious. In other words, these two people who were very close to Johnson and very close to McNamara worried that McNamara's ambition could override his good sense. And I think that was present as well among the factors that explain why he remained in power until 1968.
Thank you, Bill. Okay, I'm going to restrain myself and go to folks over here with questions. Please just introduce yourself quickly. And
my name is Alfredo Ruiz. I'm a grad student here at the LBJ School. And I have a question about the relationship between the Secretary of Defense and the President, McNamara and Johnson, and of course, future figures. You mentioned something interesting about how McNamara was privately opposed to the war, or at the same time publicly supporting first Kennedy and then Johnson, very much following the line. And I'm reminded of Colin Powell, who went to the UN and supported the war in Iraq, even though he privately was skeptical of the evidence. And I want to ask you, what can we learn about McNamara to apply for, what should be the relationship between the Secretary of Defense and any other cabinet members with the President? Should they follow what the President says? As in McNamara and Black, you have to be loyal to the President for democracy, or should they push back and try to assert their positions and their expertise, even when it's inconvenient for the commander-in-chief?
So, I think it's a delicate balancing act for every cabinet member and every senior aide in the White House. As I said, there's this natural tendency to defer to the president. But the most successful presidents are the presidents who demand candor from their top aides, who welcome dissent and welcome debate. In the end, they may make a decision that a cabinet member disagrees with, and at that point, most cabinet members feel they're obliged to carry out the decision of the president, and if they don't feel obliged, they don't feel they can carry out the decision, they leave. And you see that repeatedly in various administrations. I saw it with George Shultz. He opposed the Strategic Defense Initiative, the so-called Star Wars space-based defense against the Soviet nuclear attack. He thought it was technologically out of reach. He thought it would upend the entire nuclear deterrence doctrines of the time. He opposed it when he learned about it. The day President Reagan went on television and announced it, from that day forth, he defended it. And he made a decision. We talked about it. I said to George, why didn't you quit? He said, no, I thought we could work with it afterward, and he did try to use it as a bargaining chip with the Kremlin. He said, my job at that point is to carry out the orders of the president after the president's made a decision. So it's a delicate decision every cabinet member has to make. But I think the answer is that the more you hear dissent and the more you hear contrary opinions, the better your presidency is going to be, because the decisions you ultimately make are going to be informed by all of that.
Bill, did you want to come in on that? Should we go to the next question?
Well, I can't help but think about the current situation in the Trump administration. I think of Marco Rubio, who opposed Trump vigorously before Trump was elected in 2016. And I can't help but wonder in my mind whether he approves, as Secretary of State and National Security Advisor, of what Trump is doing. I'm pretty damn sure, on the basis of no evidence, that he does not approve. And I half expect him, if he is what I think he is, that he will resign. But the other half of my expectation is that he won't.
Thank you, Bill. Please, sir.
Hi, my name is Paul Putman. Thank you for the presentation. I'm looking forward to reading your book. I did want to respond to your comments about LBJ's mental health. I am also a psychiatrist, and I would like to discourage everyone from making assumptions about psychiatric diagnoses without professional evaluation or with permission. As a psychiatrist, we are bound by what may surprise you is called the Goldwater Rule, which actually came from the 1964 election when journalists sought out many psychiatrists to comment on Goldwater, and unfortunately, too many of them did. We are prevented from making observations about people we have not examined professionally, and from sharing any information we have, of course, without permission. And this has been reaffirmed, as you might imagine, in the last 10 years. So I know it's tempting, but I just am asking everyone to think twice about making assumptions about mental health without permission or without formal professional evaluation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. I might respond to that since I think it was directed in part at me. I am not a psychiatrist, which means I'm less qualified by far to make judgments like that. But on the other hand, as a person who isn't a psychiatrist, I'm free. I'm not bound by that rule, that Goldwater rule. What I would like to do if I were there with you would be to sit down with the gentleman who just said that and look at the evidence, which is so plentiful, both in Lady Bird's description of her husband's life and in the recollections of people like Richard Goodwin and Bill Moyers. And it might very well be that the fellow who just asked that question, even after doing that, would feel that it's wrong to well, I'm sure he would say it's wrong to speculate, but I would wonder if he were willing to talk, not for the record, whether he wouldn't agree that that's where the evidence points.
Thanks, Bill. Please, sir.
My name is Robin Stewart, and I hope you'll pardon me if there's a level of intensity in my voice. I fought in the Vietnam War. My first tour was a brand new second lieutenant with the 82nd. I deployed from Pope Air Force Base. In fact, LBJ came out there to talk to us out there in that cold February day. I returned in 1971 as a captain aviator in Vietnam. And to hear you say that man knew the war was not winnable in 1965 was staggering to me. Both of you gentlemen up here, I believe, said something like, but for the Vietnam War. You can't separate it out. You made the statement, sir, that you felt that but for the Vietnam War, he was one of the most, maybe the most effective secretaries of defense in our history. Again, you got to pardon me. I say that's garbage. He was one of the worst men in that position. And I dare say I may have as many as 58,000 other people who would agree with me. Where was the level of moral courage in that man? Where's the level of moral courage in the Congress today, or members of the cabinet that serve with President Trump today? I'm just amazed day after day. Where was the level of courage, moral courage amongst those generals who literally wouldn't show McNamara what was actually going on in the field there? They lied to him. And Admiral McGuire, I apologize, sir, because I'm talking about these flag officers and general officers. I assume you would not have done the same thing. Yeah. But see, I'm the guy at the bottom of the hill because, as we all know, excrement rolls downhill. He's up there in that handy-dandy ivory tower of his cooking hamburgers with his kid, and I'm eating cold sea rations out there. Well, anyway, thank you for your attention, sir.
Thank you.
Yeah. So, first of all, thank you for those heartfelt comments. I completely understand what you're saying, and I don't amend my comment that he would have been remembered as the most effective defense secretary we ever had it been not for Vietnam, but I would add to it, and I think it's a conclusion you can't help but take away from this book, is that because of Vietnam and his management of the war, he was the worst defense secretary we have had.
Bill?
Well, I'm reacting to that powerful statement. The one thing I would change or I would question, I think the fellow who just spoke said that McNamara knew in 1965 that the war was militarily unwinnable. I would say he thought that it was. His fear was that it was unwinnable. That's not quite so he wasn't quite as hardcore, as set in and concrete as it sounds if you say he knew. He was coping with an uncertain situation, and this was his fear. And based on that fear, he was trying to figure out what he should do.
Should we go to the next, please? Sir.
Okay, thank y'all very much. Actually, this is real quick. It was a little bit what she was mentioning about ambition. That was just a little bit of a clarification, Bill, that you were sort of talking about toward, I guess, McNamara commenting from Goodwin and Moyers. What was the ambition? Because he was already Secretary of Defense, right? What was maybe what he was looking towards? And just a clarification on use of that term, ambition.
Well, my notion is that he was ambitious. He was in this job. This was the most important work he had ever done in his life. And he wanted to continue doing it. To leave the administration, especially in protest, where would that have led? It probably would have led, if Robert Kennedy had gotten his way, to a howl of protest and a leading role in the anti-war movement. And I think McNamara just thought that would be the wrong thing to do. But underlying that conviction, I think, is his feeling that he's doing something powerful and important, and he wants to keep doing it.
Thank you, Bill. I see two more questions. Please, sir.
Hi, thank you. My name is Steve Gerson. So it's interesting looking at history in the Trump era in 2025 to McNamara versus what you hinted at the time. The domino theory was on everyone's mind. And this is a simple question with probably a semester-long answer, but is there any thinking of, did they do the right thing? Just dragging us into the war and staying in the war that was lost, that cost people their friends' lives, but maybe it changed what China and USSR were doing at the time that made things better in subsequent decades?
It's hard to answer that. I'd have to think that through in terms of Chinese behavior. I can't speak to. I know a lot about Soviet behavior, and certainly Bill knows even more. I don't know that it had much of an effect on the Kremlin at the time. Bill may have a more informed thought than me about that. Bill, do you sense that by sticking it out in Vietnam, both Johnson and then Nixon had somehow accomplished something vis-a-vis U.S.-Soviet relations?
Well, it's possible that sticking it out, remaining in Vietnam, might have pleased them for a while because they too understood that the United States looked very bad in the eyes of the world. On the other hand, not long after this, especially in the Nixon administration, the goal was détente with the Soviet Union. And from that point of view, I think they wanted to help end the war so that the United States would be freer to join with the Soviet Union in a new relationship of détente.
Great, thank you. And Jeremy Surrey.
Hi, so Jeremy Surrey. This is a question for Bill because he's not here, and so I can't ask him in person. But for those of you who don't know, Bill Taubman is a very distinguished, one of the most distinguished scholars of the Soviet Union and Russia. You never, as far as I can tell, Bill, wrote anything about U.S. history or U.S. politics before. What was it like to be a Russian historian, someone who spent your entire life writing about Khrushchev, Stalin, and Gorbachev, to write about Robert McNamara and to write about American politics at the end of your career? What was it like to do that?
Well, it's been been a very interesting transition in many ways. As I said, I hear somebody on the phone through my hearing aid. Yeah. Come in, Tom. I'm being interviewed can you come in? Oh, okay. Very sorry, folks. Very sorry, folks. Somebody came to the door to take our little dog to the dog park. But back to Jeremy. I talked about why I made the switch, but in making the switch, I discovered several things. One, it is easier to do research on an American leader in the United States for an American than it is to do research on a Soviet leader in the Soviet Union or Russia. In Russia, when I did my research in the 90s and the early 2000s, libraries were partly open, but also closed. When I wanted to speak to former officials, I had to track them down and call them up and convince them to talk to me. I remember one occasion when I reached the former KGB chief at the time of Khrushchev's ouster. This man had conspired with Brezhnev to kick out Khrushchev. Well, he agreed to see me for the tidy sum of $200. And I went to his apartment in a luxurious place in Moscow, and he gave me a revealing interview, and his wife gave me tea and cookies. So it was a mixed experience. But I remember when I was working on Gorbachev, I called up another former chief of the KGB and I said, do you have time and interest to talk to an American professor who's writing a biography of Gorbachev? And he said, I have the time, but I do not have the interest. So those are examples of what you ran into. Whereas here, of course, it's much easier to find people and to get them to talk to you. Another thing I noticed in making the transition was the sort of similarities and differences between the two countries. Khrushchev rose to the top through revolution and civil war and Stalin's bloody purges. And he defeated in the battle to succeed Stalin people like Molotov, who had blood up to his armpits, whereas McNamara, who to be sure was not seeking to become the supreme leader of the United States, in which case he would have had to fight harder. But McNamara didn't aspire to be Secretary of Defense and just sailed along in his life until the day when Kennedy called, and suddenly, without wanting to be a top leader or trying to be a top leader or fighting anybody else to become a top leader, he found himself to be Secretary of Defense. Back to researching, having described how difficult it could be in the Soviet Union, it's much easier in the United States. Too many documents are still classified, but still archives are open and people are easy to talk to. So in a way, I conclude, Jeremy, you being a specialist on, I guess, the United States, American foreign policy, as well as international relations in general, I envy you. Your job as a researcher is easier than mine was all those years as a criminologist.
Fair enough.
Which is not to say I demean your work. It's wonderful. All I know is it was a lot easier in the United States.
Let me bring this to an end by saying that for Bill, of course, this is an adjustment from a shift from Soviet history to American history, but he is a well-established master of the craft of biography, which also goes for his brother, Phil Taubman. What they have produced is to my mind, absolutely terrific and important biography of a very elusive character. I would mention too, maybe we haven't spent enough time on this today, that there are contained in this book really fascinating portraits of many people, but very much including Lyndon Johnson and Jacqueline Kennedy. If your interests run in those directions, I think you would find this book fascinating, if only for those reasons.
And I will be happy to sign books in the back if you would like.
We're a little bit over time, so let me just say thank you for sticking with us. This has been absolutely fascinating, a great honor for me. Thank you, everybody. Thank you to Phil and Bill Taubman.